Sure. Yeah. Yeah. What's is there like a focus of the podcast? What do
Not
you?
really. I mean, it will just kind of have like talk about certain things in the book that I liked and like just
Yeah.
kind of like go from there and see what happens.
Okay. Cool. Are you getting good enough audio from me? Does it sound clear?
Perfect. No,
Yeah.
perfect
Okay.
audio, yeah. Cool,
Good.
Joe. So
So
yeah, you wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called The Power of Strangers: Benefits of Connecting in a Suspicious World. And it was really kind of immersive journalism. You went like all over the world talking to researchers and doing workshops yourself. And as far as I'm aware, you grew up in a very busy city surrounded by strangers your entire life, and you come from kind of a gregarious, extroverted family. And I just wanted to ask you, what was like your orientation towards strangers before you started this whole process of writing the book and talking to strangers?
yeah, it's a good question. So I grew up in Boston in the States, and I wouldn't say Boston is a particularly friendly town. I think people are fairly hostile. They're very funny,
Oh,
but they
right.
talk a lot of shit. I live in New York now. I actually find, ironically, New York is much friendlier. But my
Mm,
family, as you said, were great ones for talking to strangers, my parents in particular. So I grew up in a funeral home family. My
mm,
father was a funeral director, my grandfather was a funeral director. So they spent a lot of time, obviously, just connecting with people, right? That's part of the
mm,
job. But my parents were notorious. They would go to a restaurant and they would like reach across two tables to ask somebody about their food, or they had a
so funny.
question, or they noticed something, right? So for my through my childhood, there were always people around. It was normal to see my parents talking to people they didn't know. I know that's like mortifying to a lot of teenagers that like their
Mm,
parents are talking to everybody. But it was normal for me, and I saw the benefits of it. We would have like strangers at Christmas. Like my father came home one holiday, might have been Thanksgiving or Christmas, with like two bagpipers that he had met. And so then we had like bagpipers at Christmas, right? So they've
nice.
always done stuff like that. And even to this day, they'll go on vacation and then I will get a phone call from someone they met being like, "Oh, your parents said I should give you a call." It's just like,
Wow.
you could give out my email address, but maybe not my phone number. So they're great for it. And I saw, growing up with that, I got to see them reap the benefits of that. So they were always making new friends. They were very social. Every event we had at the house would have a million people at it. Like our house was like a
Mm,
train station. There were just people going through all the time. So, very normal and very beneficial. As I got older, I got into journalism. Journalism is obviously, in some regard, is the art of talking to strangers, right? Like you
mm,
have to find something to talk about. You have to connect with people. You have to get them to trust you. In some cases, it's a little harder edged. You have to get information out of them, whatever it is. But so as I entered my professional career, I was still talking to people I didn't know all the time. And some of the biggest moments of my life, like some very formidable moments, came out of just chatting people up, right?
mm.
Um, but then something happened a few years ago. So when we had our daughter, I noticed like in the 2 years that followed, while I used to make a habit of talking to people, I'd go to a bar, I'd go to a cafe, I would just kind of like chat with people on the street.
Mm.
I had stopped doing it and I noticed it, and I wondered why I had stopped doing it. And as far as I could tell, it had to do with two things. Number one, I had an iPhone, right? And if you have an
Mm.
iPhone and you're of a certain privileged group, like you can literally go the rest of your life without ever talking to a stranger again,
Mm.
right? It's a sad fact of that
Yeah.
technology is as easy as it makes some things. And also that we just had a baby, right? I was tired and I was spending a lot of time inside and I wasn't circulating like I used to. And so as a result, to the extent I ever went to a bar, I would be sitting there on my phone, which is like the saddest thing ever. Or I would go to the drugstore and I would use the self-checkout lane to avoid talking to it was just like almost like my body was compensating for being exhausted all the time by
Mm.
avoiding situations where I would have to put effort into talking to
Mm.
strangers. We can talk about that a bit too, the effort that it takes. And so, yeah, it's just got me wondering, like, what caused me to withdraw like this? And what did it cost me? What am I losing by not having these interactions on a regular basis? And then, as you said, that sent me down a million different research rabbit holes.
Well, fascinating. Yeah, because I know you said as well, like when you're at the grocery store, you'll kind of you were at least inclined to go to the self-service checkout, and that's something I find in myself as well because it's frictionless, it's convenient, and you don't have to go through the effort or the awkwardness of actually acknowledging another person.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is actually effort, right? There was a psychologist who studied this who, God, I apologize to him. I can't remember his name right now. He was at the University of Michigan, but he did a bunch of experiments on the cognitive load involved in talking to strangers, right? So if you're talking to a friend or a relative or someone you know, you don't really have to put that much effort into it because you know who they are. You have
Mm,
background, you have, like your kind of framework to understand them. You have history, all this stuff. So you don't have to pay attention to like body language as much as you do when you're talking to a stranger. But when you are talking to someone you've never met before, even if it's just like chatting with somebody who's working at a cash register, you are listening more closely to them than you might with your friends. You
mm,
are thinking more about what you're going to say. You're thinking about how you're coming across. You're watching their body language. You're monitoring your own body language. Maybe you're offering like a running commentary of your own performance in this conversation while it's
mm,
happening, right? Like there's a lot of stuff to keep track of. And
mm.
it's actually tiring. It's cognitively tiring to have these sorts of conversations. And so, on one level, we could talk about social anxiety and things like that, but it actually is like real effort, right? It's more effort to have a conversation with a stranger than it is to have one with someone you know. And, as a species, we evolved to be effort saving organisms. We look for efficiencies, we look for ways to like save calories. But
Mm.
this is one of the ways where we seek efficiencies that long term doesn't actually benefit us.
For sure, yeah, it is really like an effort and a skill that you develop over time. It used to be innate and just like fundamental to being a human, but nowadays you can operate in the world literally without ever having to confront and talk to a stranger. And it's kind of tragic in a way, isn't it? Like the world has never had more people in it, but we've never been more kind of disconnected and siloed and blinkered into our own like realities.
Yeah, it's true. It's weird because you can be a foot away from somebody and exist a universe away from them, right?
Yeah.
There's this condition that sociologists call strangeness, which is sort of like alienation from your environment in some ways, right? And
Hmm.
so in the past, if you lived in a physical environment with a bunch of other people in like close quarters, you would just know all those people. You might hate
Hmm.
some of those people, but like they were around, you were engaging with them.
Hmm.
It's a very modern thing to be able to be in a room with a bunch of people and not be in the room with a bunch of people. Like mentally, you are somewhere else, even though physically you're here. There's a disembodiment that's kind of permitted or even incentivized by technology. But the tragedy of it is, it's bad for society for people to not know each other. It's actually very
Hmm.
beneficial for people to know each other. And it helps you learn to negotiate difficulty and things like that. But, one thing that turned up that was very interesting in the research is, ironically, we've lived with strangers for like the advent of cities is 7,000 years ago. Like we've lived among strangers for a very long time, right? Only in the last 20 years or so have psychologists really begun studying like what it means to talk to a stranger. So I spent a bunch of time with a psychologist named Gillian Sandstrom, she's from Toronto and lives in the UK now, lives in England. And she's done a bunch of experiments that tried to understand what keeps people from talking to strangers,
Hmm.
but also like what the benefits of them are, what the benefits of those interactions are. And she found that, like, number one, everybody is mortified by the prospect of talking to strangers, right? Like, I read the survey data on these, and she would ask people how they expected this to go. And they'd be like, it's going to be a nightmare. Like, these people are going to think I'm crazy. I'm going to get murdered. And then the reality of what their actual experience was when they went out to do it as part of these studies, to go out to talk to people, was that no one was rejected. Everybody had like a very positive experience. And some of the psychological benefits that Jillian found in these experiments was that when people did talk to a stranger, and that could even be like a little chat with the barista at Starbucks, they came away feeling a more enhanced sense of well being, less lonely, less pessimistic, more hopeful, more connected to their environment, right? More connected to their communities. There's a host of benefits that come from what seems to be like a completely throwaway interaction. And so, as we withdraw from the presence of other people and connection with other people, we lose that. And those are actually really important. Those are things that enrich your life.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is like weak ties, like the ties that we have with people that we see on a daily basis. We might know their name, but we see them kind of frequently, and that they're actually almost just as beneficial as our close familial and friendship connections that we have. So like we've so many opportunities to connect with people, and yeah, it's maybe easier if not. Just a lot of people are kind of glued into their own little world and keep the head down. But yeah, weak ties are super important, right?
Yeah, and it totally makes sense too. I mean, when you think about it, especially if you live in a city. The city's defined by a certain degree of chaos, right? You don't see the same people all the time.
Hmm.
And so a weak tie is just someone that you would nod to, right? You don't know their life story. You might not even know their name, but you encounter them and you come to expect them to be in a certain place. And
Hmm.
what that does is add like a sense of stability to the world, right? However chaotic the world might be, there's this guy is always going to be at the convenience store, right? This person's always going to be
Hmm.
at the subway station,
Hmm.
and there's something very reassuring about that. It is like it's like a port in a storm in a way. And then when you actually do meet them, you get access to all the things you get access to when you form relationships with people, right? Like you learn about opportunities, you get stories, you make friends, all that stuff. But even when it's an insignificant, a seemingly insignificant interaction with a person on the kind of periphery of your life, it can be really beneficial.
Yeah, like you never know kind of what might happen from just like, asking something not a scripted kind of a question to somebody. The conversation can go in so many different ways. And yeah, I think your book inspired me to just try that. We always undershoot in our like conversations with the barista or somebody that we know on the periphery. But what about like shooting, not oversharing, but just maybe going a little step further as opposed to how are you? Maybe, broaden the topic of
Yeah,
conversation.
it's a huge question. I mean, it's basically you think of every interaction in terms of stages, right? So you encounter somebody, say they're, hypothetically, they're wearing a hat that you like, right?
Mm.
You can't, it's a little difficult to go up to someone and just be like, I like your hat, because then they're going to think that you're nuts and you're going to attack them and take the hat, right? So you have to deal with people's suspicion towards strangers, however warranted it may or may not be.
Mm.
So what you have to do is almost go through a series of steps to show to them that you are not an agent of chaos, you're not a thief. If there's a really interesting idea called a pre-frame, which if you're on the subway, where the norm is usually to not talk to strangers, right? If you want to talk to someone, you can't just blurt out, I like your hat, unless you have like the magic touch, right? Those people exist. I'm not one of them, but some people are able to do that. Instead, you have to acknowledge that you're breaking the norm by talking to them. So you could be like, I know we're not supposed to talk to anyone on the subway, but like, can I just say, I like your hat, right?
Mm.
So it's just something to like get the suspicion down a little bit, show them that you're in control, show them that you're not going to be like a mess that they have to wash off afterwards, and kind of get work your way in. Another really cool approach is, we all have, like you said, scripts where we use scripts as ways to interact with people without interacting with them,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
like you buy a cup of coffee and you say, how you doing? And the person says, fine, how are you? And you say, I'm fine. You're doing it because it would be weird not to do it. It would be rude not to acknowledge the human being standing like 2 feet away from you, but you don't care, right?
Mm.
You're not trying, you're not revealing anything, you're not interested in the person. And we do that all day long, right? You do that 20 times a day. There's a technique where when someone says, how you doing? You don't just say, fine, how are you? You give them an actual answer,
Mm.
right? Um, and you can see that. I do that a lot. You can see them wake up when you do that, right? And your actual answer can't be gross and it can't be an overshare. It can't be like, oh, my neck's killing me today. Like, don't be boring. But you can actually be specific. And then you ask them how they're doing, and you'll see the vast majority of the time they'll actually respond with some sort of specificity too. There's a great bit that a woman named Georgie Nightingale in London does, where when someone asks her how she is, she'll answer on a scale of 1 to 10. Just be like, I don't know, I'm a 7. How are you? And they will. I've done this. I've literally never not had someone do this. They'll respond with a number, right? And now you're talking, right? Now, like both sides have been awakened to the fact that something else is going on here. You're both paying attention, and you can have a little back and forth. It doesn't have to be like a profound conversation. You don't have to bare your soul, but those are the sorts of what they call minimum social interactions that can actually be really beneficial. In some cases, can lead to great conversations. They can lead to friendships, but you do need to get over that little hump at first to make everybody comfortable and make sure that like you're on the same footing.
Yeah, I think what puts us off so much time is like our fear of rejection and actually
Yeah.
thinking that this person does not want to be approached. They're going to think I'm weird. What are we going to talk about? How am I going to end the conversation? It's just going to be an unpleasant encounter. But from what you talked about in the book as well with the research is it's actually a wholesome, like positive experience for the conversation starter and also the recipient.
Yeah, it's crazy. There's a guy named Nicholas Epley who's a psychologist at the University of Chicago who did a series of experiments in Chicago and then in London, where he just set people out to talk to strangers on mass transit, right? And you can pull that in Chicago. Chicago is like fairly friendly. It's a
Okay.
Midwestern city. But Londoners seem to believe that they are like the most unfriendly people on earth, right?
Noble.
And what Epley found, and that's never been my experience. I've spent a lot of time in London, and I love Londoners.
Yeah.
What Epley found was that like every single one of those people went out predicting disaster. We're going to get rejected. He was like,
Mm.
what percentage of these people are going to reject you? And I think their prediction was like 45%, right? It was going to be a ton of rejection. He sent out hundreds of people to go chat with people on the tube or on the CTA in Chicago, and literally not a single one had been rejected. Not a single one, range of ages, men and women, nobody was rejected. So it would seem that the fear of rejection is, sort of baseless, but it's a paralyzing fear,
Yeah.
because what you're doing is you're going up against what appears to be a social norm, and human beings have a very difficult time like violating social norms, being a social species, right? Um, but yeah, it really does tend to work out pretty well despite our fear of it. One other note that's related to that is that, Gillian Sandstrom, the psychologist, has been she's been managing what she calls a fear inventory for like 15 years, which is all the things people have said for why they don't talk to strangers, right? It's every single excuse, or in their minds, it's not an excuse, it's a real fear, what they say. And overwhelmingly, the leading fear isn't rejection, though that ranks pretty highly. It's the fear that you're going to be boring and you won't know what to talk about, right? That you'll just like, you'll be like, hi, how you doing? And then clam up,
Mhm.
and then you just like, you start sweating and everyone's very uncomfortable. So that's the main fear, actually. And Jillian has been finding that over and over and over and over again, study after study after study, which is, I found very interesting.
Right. I think it's I first time I came across it in your book, pluralistic ignorance.
Yes.
Can you
Yeah.
explain that?
Yeah, that's Nicholas Epley. That's his theory. It's just basically like a collective misunderstanding, right?
Mm,
So the idea of the social norm on the subway being that no one talks to each other, no one it leads us to believe that no one wants to be spoken to, right?
mm,
So when you go into a train and you want to talk to somebody, you assume that they don't. The reason why they're not talking to people is because they don't want to talk to people.
mm,
But in many cases, the reason they're not talking to people is because they don't think it's allowed,
mm,
right? And when people do initiate these interactions, they start talking to strangers, they find that the people are actually quite receptive.
mm.
And the conversations, I think, in the predictions for the Epley study, people expected the conversations to last like a minute, and the average conversation lasted 15 minutes, right? So
Wow.
from the moment they met to like the time they got off the train, people had no trouble talking to each other. Right. So
Amazing.
that's another one of those things where it is a fear, but it's not necessarily a deeply rooted fear. It's not necessarily baseless. It's not necessarily, based in reality. But yeah, it comes from like this collective misunderstanding. And as a social species, we like connecting with people. We need to connect to people in order to remain mentally healthy, right? And so it makes sense that we're rewarded when we have these interactions, right? When we have these connections, it's good for us. We need it. It's the way it's like nutrition.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I kind of experienced that myself. I was in the sauna the other day and there was like four people there and I'm like in it, I'm not home and I like talking to people, but it was like silence. Nobody was talking for a few minutes. Then I just broke the ice with the guy next to me. And before long we were all having this like kind of engaged, like lighthearted conversation and everyone was there. And it felt like they were happy to participate. But before that, they were like, no, we're all just like keeping the peace here and that's what's going on. But like it kind of inside maybe they were happy to have a conversation.
They might have not even known what they wanted, but you in that case, like you provided the permission, right? You gave everybody permission to talk. They didn't feel like they had permission before.
That's right.
And then you just changed, you shifted it, and then everybody had permission and everybody was comfortable. But that's the power of a social norm, is that when
Mm,
you feel that society is telling you not to do something, like there are physical, like we react physically to the act of transgressing a norm. Like it makes us very, very uncomfortable. But it doesn't take that much to knock people out of it. So your experience is like,
yeah.
that's been my experience too. You just kind of, if you can start a conversation, then like people are all in, and it can be really fun. But starting it can be challenging.
Yeah, who knew like it's countercultural to like, engage in interaction with our fellow human beings, but that's
Yeah,
where we
it's
are at the
true.
moment.
I know, I know. Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Joe, talk to me about the mere belonging effect and your Red Sox hat and how we kind of
Yeah.
have incidental similarities with people that we go on.
Yeah, it comes back to the idea that we are like a hypersocial species, right? Like we are an unusually social species, much more so than like our closest genetic relatives, chimpanzees. Excuse my squeaky chair, who are tend to be pretty xenophobic. Like we are xenophilic as a species. I know it doesn't seem that way, but most of the time we are seeking connections. We want connections. Now, if we feel threatened, we go hard in the opposite direction, right? We're kind of dual nature like that, but we like connections. And so subconsciously, we're always looking for ways to facilitate a connection with another person. And that could speak to your experience in the sauna, where we just need someone to give us permission to talk. But in the case of mere belonging and incidental similarities, which are two terms in the psychology research, it's literally looking for something you have in common with somebody else. It could just be like a visual cue, right? It could be you're wearing, some of the research on this is actually really funny because they would do studies where they would give someone a t-shirt that had like the number of 350 on it. And then they would show them photos of people. And one of those people would have the same shirt. And they'd be like, who do you like the most? And they'd be like, oh, that guy. Like that guy's far more trustworthy than the rest of them are. So it's laughable how easy it is. But it's true. Like this is how we seek to connect with people. So if someone has the same shoes as you, someone has the same headphones, someone has the same birthday. There's been a lot of research on that, of being like, if you tell someone they have the same birthday, they'll like you more, right? These are meaningless signifiers. In my case, the funniest one was, so like I said, I grew up in Boston. And while I don't really follow the Red Sox anymore, I still wear a Red Sox hat because I think it's a great hat for one thing, and it's my hometown. And I would get coffee at the same coffee shop every morning that the mayor of New York used to get coffee at. So when Bill de Blasio was mayor, he would come to the same place because he lived across the street. And he grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. So I ended up knowing the mayor because of the hat. I would be wearing a Red Sox hat and he would come over and start talking about the Red Sox. And which at this point, like I'm just bullshitting my way through the conversation because I don't follow them anymore, right? But
Right.
I could get through it. And then we would end up talking about politics or, I remember one day he went on Fox News just on a lark to see how he would do. And he thought he did kind of great, talked to him about that. But then I just came to know like the mayor of New York just because of this baseball hat. If I wasn't wearing that baseball hat, he would have no interest in me and we never would have met, right? And you can see that with like people who have dogs, right? When people who are like walking dogs, they're instantly comfortable with other people walking dogs.
Yeah, it's so true.
Right? Like many monsters have had dogs, like Hitler had a dog, right? It doesn't mean you're a great person, but that alone, like that kind of otherwise relatively meaningless similarity makes people very comfortable and open to bonding with strangers, right?
hmm Yeah, no, absolutely. Joe, can you tell me about like the where evolutionary wise, like where we came from and the societies, tribes we used to live in? I think for like 99% of our history, we were in hunter-gatherer societies where everything was like egalitarian and shared and divvied up. And yeah, so can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the interesting research, or a lot of the interesting part of doing the book was going back through the anthropological record to try to find answers. And, our pessimistic reading of our own nature is that it's novel that we are able to live relatively peaceably among people we don't know, right? So
Hmm.
you think that like 100,000 years ago, you would just murder the stranger, right? Someone turned up who you didn't know, you would just kill the person. Like it only makes sense. But that led me to a lot of very interesting research that wasn't the case. There was a term, um, oh God, I can't remember what it was, but it's basically like there was much more fluidity between hunter-gatherer bands than we would give ourselves credit for, right? So you have, say, 15 people in a band, and then there's 15 people in this band over here. Yes, they could fight, right? But then they're just going to kill each other and they're all going to die, right? They're going to, it's so much effort, it's so costly to fight. And also, they need to intermarry. You can't just keep marrying your cousins over and over again, right? Your children are going to grow horns after a while. So you need to find new populations of people. And so there was a lot more fluidity to those cultures than we would expect, where a new person would kind of wander over here. This hunter-gatherer band would take a lot of precautions about like allowing them in, but they would create a pathway that would allow them to demonstrate to the band that they're not dangerous, right? In the same way that we talked about initiating a conversation with strangers. They did something called greeting rituals, where like elaborate, kind of long drawn out rituals that would allow the visitor to show themselves to be beneficial and friendly, right? They have different stages. It's all very interesting. But that was the reality of the situation. The reality wasn't that we've been like murderously xenophobic forever. The reality is that we have, even though we've been suspicious, we've always found ways to connect with other groups, right?
Mm.
Ritualized ways, whatever it is. And that was one of the reasons why humanity was able to spread in the way it did, because it allowed populations to merge and meet and new groups to form and knowledge to be shared and innovations to be shared. You know, you think about it, if you're just like 8 people out in the veldt, and you're looking for water, yes, you could just look for water, but it's probably better if you know like 20 other people and they might be able to point
Mm.
you in the right direction.
Mhm.
And you start, you start to see groups practice exchange, right? They start having like regular gatherings where they can all get reacquainted with each other. They start doing gift giving, ritual gift giving to like keep those relationships healthy, because it's actually really beneficial to know a lot of people. You know,
Mm.
as long as you can keep a lid on hostility, um, it's usually to your benefit to like make friends, to build these
Mm.
relationships. And so yeah, I found that really interesting. You know, to the point of the point about the greeting rituals. Like, to give you an example, this is in the Kalahari Desert. There was an anthropologist observed a greeting ritual involving, I forget which group it was, but you would have the tribe, the hunter-gatherer band, and then like a stranger would appear. And what the stranger would do is make sure they were seen, right? They would get close enough that people could see them, so it didn't seem like they were sneaking up. They would have a weapon, they would throw the weapon, and they would be completely unarmed, and then they would sit down and they would wait. And so by doing this, what have they demonstrated? They demonstrated that they're willing to make themselves vulnerable by
Mm.
throwing away their weapon. It shows that they possess the self-control to sit quietly under a tree for like sometimes hours until the group like decided to go approach them. And then eventually, usually an elder of the group would walk out. They would kind of crouch together, often not making eye contact, speaking very softly, again, to show that you're not chaotic, you have self-control. And then gradually, maybe the person brings out a little food, and then gradually the person is allowed access to the group, right? And so the reason I love that framework is because we see the same thing all the time when we talk to new people, right? Like, we're appearing, but we're not like jumping up, we're not like leaping behind someone and being like, "How you doing?" You know, we come in straight ahead. We do not move like in an erratic way. You try to be pretty calm. You try to like really telegraph how friendly you are. Your body language is very open. Your eyebrows are up. You're smiling.
Mm.
You're polite. You know, by showing politeness, it shows that you have self control. And then respectfully, you come together, and then you can start to talk after that. It's a much more abbreviated process today. Obviously, it happens in
Mm.
seconds. It doesn't happen in hours.
Mm.
But you can still see that there. And when you want to get into the habit of talking to strangers, it's good to keep that in mind, right? Like, accept that they might be suspicious of you at first, and
Mm.
then do what you can do in order to allay that suspicion, so that you can actually have an interaction afterwards.
Sure. Yeah. What it sounds like you're talking about there, like back in the day, like years, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we lived in these tribes, there would be kind of this gradual initiation process to kind of become comfortable with a stranger. And nowadays, you think there's anything to like, you know, the way we live in like big cities and towns where like for 99% of the people we encounter, we do not know. And like we're on like, you know, a subway in subways or undergrounds or whatever, confined in small places with loads of people we do not know and we're not engaging with them, we don't know their intentions. Do you think that that is actually stressful for our brain?
Yeah, yeah. There's a term for it, called overload, which is just what it sounds like. There's so much stimulation that we get into like a defensive crouch, you know? So
Right.
you're like walking down, say, in New York City, Fifth Avenue around Christmas time. There's an unimaginable amount of people out in the
Mm,
streets, right?
mm,
And so, sure, you could like attempt to make eye contact with everybody and ponder like the miraculous complexity of every one of them, but you would just have a stroke in like 5 minutes, right? It's
right.
too much to
Yeah.
consider.
Yeah.
So, we come up with techniques for dealing with overload, and oftentimes that is sort of shutting down. Like, you just look straight ahead, maybe you
Right.
put your headphones on, maybe you have sunglasses on, but just to like keep stimulation at bay, at
Mm,
a tolerable level. So it's totally normal, right?
mm,
It becomes problematic when it just becomes your way of being in the world.
mm,
You certainly see people walking down like a quiet street and they have like their shields up, right? It's tricky. You just have to kind of deal, you have to adjust your approach depending on the environment you're in. So I'm not going to stop somebody on Fifth Avenue and just be like, "I like your hat," because
mm,
again, that's a crazy thing to do, and they will be very threatened by that. But if I'm in a coffee shop in line, or I'm walking down the street and you just see someone and it's like it's quiet enough that people are paying attention, that's when you can occasionally just like start chatting with somebody. And the trick is to just not default to having your shields up all the time. To
Yeah.
like, how can you retain a certain amount of openness without going mad from overstimulation?
Yeah, and it's something you kind of notice. I find myself in like towns and villages, smaller communities, people are a lot more open and receptive to like, engaging in conversation with strangers. Because again, if you're in a big city, you can't acknowledge everyone and you kind of have to just like, be on your own path because it is overwhelming. Just so many different people running around and you can't really engage, obviously.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I remember I went to Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the U.S. when I was like a teenager. I went there with my brother to see the Red Sox play the Minnesota Twins. And again, like we came from a fairly gruff and unfriendly place, I think. But I remember walking down the street in the middle of Minneapolis and someone just being like, "Good morning." And the two of us were just like, we were like, "Hey, good morning," and then they walked away, and we were like, "What the fuck was that guy's problem?" It was like an alien. It was alien for someone to just do that in the street.
Yep.
But that speaks to also like different friendliness cultures in different places, different environments that can be tied to like the local culture, the population density, all that stuff. But I do find the noticing, right? So if you're not even talking to people, it's really both beneficial and like enjoyable to walk through a busy street and just like notice, right? Just like look at people, not like
Mm.
leering at people, but just like notice what people are doing and
Hmm.
think about them a little bit. And there has been a little bit of research that showed that some of the benefits you get from talking to strangers, you can actually get simply from observing strangers,
Oh.
just by, looking at them, almost like registering their humanity, right? Because I don't think
Mm.
we really, like when we're walking through a mob of people, I don't think we think of the units of that mob to be particularly human or wholly human, right?
Yeah.
But to do that and kind of ponder their humanity and kind of notice stuff about them, even if you're not going to talk to them, can actually be really helpful too. And also, I just find it fascinating because I find people interesting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that segues into one of my favorite kind of parts of the book where you went to LA and you participated in this free listening thing where you would stand on the sidewalk with like I think a cardboard thing saying free listening and people would just approach you and offload and they almost thought you were suspicious to begin with and then they would just start talking and you were there strictly just to listen and just to engage a little bit in conversation. But also
Yeah,
afterwards, how you like had this openness that stayed with you thereafter and you found like strangers just approaching you and starting to talk to you. I found that really fascinating.
yeah, it's the weirdest thing. So the story with that is there was an organization called Urban Confessional that was founded by an actor named Ben Mathis in Los Angeles. And Ben just, he hit this point in his life where I think he was going through a divorce. He felt really lonely and kind of isolated. And he just started talking to people and he realized it had this really beneficial effect for him. And so he created this organization that would put two people out on a street with a sign that said free listening, like a
Mm.
crude cardboard sign. Um, and they ended up, I think they have chapters all over the world at this point. But you would sign up, you would be paired with someone, only two people, right? Because only like one person out there would be intimidating to people. Three people would also be intimidating. So two is like the magic number he found. You stand there with your sign, and then you just kind of say hi to people and nothing else, and you just wait for people to come over and talk to you.
Right.
And I had read about that, and I called him when I was doing the book, and I was like, if I come out to LA, can I do this with you?" And he's like, "Yeah." So going out there, I was very uncomfortable with this idea, right? Like this is not my thing to stand out there with a sign, and it all seemed I gotta put it, not quite new agey, but I didn't really
Hippie.
buy it, and I wanted to see what it felt like. And so I met up with him. We got breakfast, and then we went and found a corner in East Los Angeles, and we stood there with our little sign, like a dinky little sign, and sure enough, people talked to us the entire time. So you'd be standing there with a sign that says free listening. People would come over and they would say, "What is this?" And we'd be like, "Oh, we're just, we're part of this group, Urban Confessional. We're just here to listen to people if they have anything they want to say." And just be like, you introduce yourself. And people would just tell you their life stories. And it was a real cross section of society. You got like a really diverse group of people, from like a guy in a Porsche to like a homeless guy to a musician. And these people would come over, and the moment you gave them permission to tell you something, they would just tell you everything. It would all come out. And it ended with a guy who drove by 3 times before finally stopping, and he was like, I have to ask, like, what is this? And so we explained it to him, and then we talked to him for like a half an hour. He was
Wow.
like a recovering alcoholic. He worked in Hollywood. It was a great story. Um, but it goes back to what I was saying about like if you give people permission, they will take it. They'll take the opportunity. And every single one of them at the end of the conversation would just be like, this has been really nice. Like, thank you for chatting.
Mm,
And the rule with Ben was that, we when we get nervous, when we get uncomfortable in a conversation with someone new, we tend to talk about ourselves too much, right?
mm,
We default to like the topic we're most comfortable with, which is
yeah.
ourselves. So the rule with the Urban Confessional, which is a great rule, is it's called imbalanced conversation. And what that means is you can only talk about yourself 20% of the time. You
Mm,
have to let them talk about themselves 80% of the time. And you only really talk about yourself to like make them comfortable or show that you understand or show that you have some sort of shared similarity to like, to facilitate them and to keep them talking. But yeah, it was a remarkable thing. I mean, I got chills thinking about it now, and I certainly had chills doing it. And then for days after, I would just be out in the world and people would just come up to me and start talking to me.
no
And
way.
while researching this book, when I would do something very intensive like that, like I went to Finland to take place in this like giant, like conversational banquet, um, people would just start talking to you. You develop like a weird aura, like some sort of energy that people can pick up on that makes them want to tell you things. And every single person I've talked to who like makes a practice of doing this, whether they're extroverted, introverted, male, female, they all speak to that same effect. And some of the people I got to spend time with who do it all the time, who are great at it, people, they just have this magnetism, right? That
Mhm.
comes from that. And it just speaks to like the power of our need for attraction, that our antenna are so sensitive that we can detect the presence of someone who might listen to us in a like unusual situation, you know?
Right, yeah, it just comes down to like body language, being open, eye contact, and yeah, something like an aura, subtlety about you
Yeah,
that
there's
people are.
something weird and metaphysical about it that I don't understand, and no one can ever explain. But yeah, but it's also like you look at people, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
in the habit of noticing, then you're noticing, and people notice being noticed as long as you're not being a creep about it.
Yeah, because that's a skill that I'm really trying to develop and get better at is like listening. And I find myself, I've done a few of these podcasts now, and I'll like go back and look at them, and I'll be like, "Wow, he said something really profound there, and he
Oh
didn't
yeah,
really follow up on it." You know what I mean? So
yeah.
it really is a skill to be developed, and I can only imagine that that can help you just like give people the space to like freeload and to not like interject and to really take on board what they're saying.
Yeah, it's funny, I mentioned that woman, Georgie Nightingale, in London. She runs an organization called Trigger Conversations. And I attended a class, like a weekend class that she held to literally teach people how to talk to strangers.
Right.
And there were a lot of exercises, and I just wanted to understand like every single moving part that goes into these interactions, right? I wanted to
Mm.
start from zero. And one of the assignments was we were paired with a partner, and we were supposed to ask them about their day and see if you can get to something revealing. Not like scandalous, but like see if you can get them to give you to say something to you that is like a little deeper, a
Mhm.
stronger indication of who they are as people. And the way you do that is you say, what did you have for breakfast? And then just try to go from there by only asking questions, right?
Mm.
Why'd you have that? Have you been eating that for a long time? And if you do that enough, eventually people will like go somewhere.
Right.
And to your earlier point, it's almost always surprising. It's rarely what you expect.
Mm.
But what I did in that situation was I was like, okay, I'm gonna get the gold here. I'm gonna find the nugget. And so the person like said what they had for breakfast, and I think in like four questions, I had them talking about something existential, like something philosophical. And so I was obviously quite proud of myself because this is what, as a journalist, this is what you do. You have to get there quick. And so I, like a dog with a grouse in my teeth, like I went back to the teacher and I was like, yeah, like got it. It was great, great conversation. And she was just like, yeah, that wasn't a conversation. She was like, I was watching your body language the whole time. That was an interrogation. Like you were leaning forward and peppering the person with questions. And like, yes, you got something interesting. But when you do that, when you're that active and you're steering the conversation, what you're doing is trying to land it somewhere that's interesting to you, right?
Mm.
Like when we interject in conversations, it's always a way to try to steer it towards an area that we're interested in.
Yeah.
And one of the real challenges of talking to strangers is to be comfortable with the unknown and to
Mhm.
let the person you're talking to like choose the direction. And
Mm.
the way you do that is just through open-ended questions. So it wouldn't be like, do you like sports? Yes. Well, do you like baseball? What's your favorite baseball team? You don't try to trap them in your world. You just say like why, when, how, who was that? Like, how did that make you feel? And then eventually you basically like help them find what they want to talk about.
Mm.
And that's where it gets really interesting because people become undeniably complex when you give them that space, right? It's impossible to maintain a perception that humans are like one dimensional because they
Yeah.
will go in places. You might look at someone and say, this is what that person's into, this is how they think. But if you give them the microphone and let them go, they will take you somewhere surprising. And that's always been my favorite thing about doing this stuff.
Yeah, no, totally. Like, what are some of the major guidelines and things that you've learned from all the various like workshops and classes that you've done in terms of just like talking to strangers? What skills have you acquired through
Yeah, I
that
would say
process?
the really big one is, to what you were saying, learning to listen and learning to ask open-ended questions, not to Bigfoot the conversation.
Mm.
And even if it makes you uncomfortable, let it go where it's going to go. And there have been cases where I had a conversation, like there was one with a guy on the subway who came over to me. It was in that run I had where people were just telling me stuff. He came over and started talking to me. And I was doing my thing and I'm just asking him, kind of open-ended questions. And he started going in a direction that I was not super comfortable with, that wasn't harassing me or anything. He was a perfectly nice guy,
Mm.
but had a very different worldview than me. But I had to be like, just keep going, just keep letting him talk. And he ended up telling like an extraordinary story, right? And then we parted ways and I never saw him again. So you
Mm.
do have to have like, the confidence and the sort of risk-taking willingness to just let it go, right? Like hands off, relinquish control of the conversation. Not in a way if it makes you feel like physically unsafe, get out of there.
Mm.
But generally that way, like, let it go where it's going to go, let it unfold the way it's going to unfold. And the way you do that is by listening and by asking those questions. And then, earlier I was talking about like initiating conversations. Those are great too. I usually, I do this a lot. Instead of doing a scripted greeting, so if I'm at a coffee shop, say, and I would usually say, "How you doing? Fine. How are you?" I'll say, "How you doing?" And they'll say, "Fine." And I'll say, "Are people behaving themselves in here today?" And that is like a great conversation starter because the answer is almost always no, right? And then, but what you've done with that is you've acknowledged that you understand that that job is a very difficult job, right? So I always do this with like waiters, with people who work in stores because those jobs they're really fucking hard and they're so much worse now than they were before the pandemic because so many people forgot how to be human during the pandemic.
Yep.
And so, you show a little bit of empathy by saying something that shows you assume that it's a tough gig. And then sometimes they tell you like a hilarious story about somebody being awful to them. And then you have a little interaction. And, I've had conversations that went on for a little bit based on that. But sometimes it's just like, I remember it was like a teenager in a grocery store who at the end of a fairly brief exchange that I started that way, it was just like, thank you for being nice, you know?
Mm.
And so that's good. Like it makes them feel human, right? Like people in the service industry are just dehumanized
Yep.
minute after minute, hour after hour. So it is kind of a kindness just to go in there and show that you recognize that it's hard, that they're people and this is a tough job. But it also opens up like some really hair-raising, hilarious and troubling stories. And you can get some really good conversations off of that.
Yeah, totally. Like I was actually guilty of that the other day when I was reading your book and looking at the study where they found like people who talk to their baristas, they were just instructed to go in, try to have a conversation with your barista and see what happens. And they had like a more pleasant experience exchange or whatever. And I was in Starbucks with my coffee without really having any type of exchange with the barista. So yeah, no, for me going forward, definitely yeah, try to just get more out of those minor interactions because it's true to say that people with more weak ties and more interactions with the world in general report yes better feelings of well-being, but they're going to live longer. Nearly all their health outcomes are better. So like it's not just something that's nice to do. It's like imperative for us to be fully flourishing human beings is to interact and
Yeah,
communicate.
nicely said. Yeah, I mean, loneliness is a killer, right? And this is a good way to deal with loneliness for sure.
Yeah, because that's kind of how evolution designed us, right? Like it rewards us for connection and like punishes us for isolation. That's why like isolation, loneliness feels painful, and it's like a
Yeah.
kick to kind of get back and integrate into a group, right?
Yeah, and it makes you crazy. And I think I don't know if I have like a strong empirical basis for making this claim, but I do think it's a driver of toxic politics right? I
Mm.
think there is a definite connection, at least in the United States, of the tone of our politics and the levels of loneliness experienced by people in the US. And I always think of this experiment that someone did a few years ago about mice. Mice are social, right? So there was an experiment where
Mm.
scientists isolated a mouse from the rest of the mice, right? And then kept it isolated for a while. And of course, like it was suffering, right? These are
Mm.
social animals; they need to be with their kind. And then he gradually introduced it back to the other mice, and it was so stressed out by the prospect of like being with them again that even though he missed them terribly, it
Mm.
just started attacking the other mice. Like it was just a rage case. This mouse
Oh,
came back like really angry because I think it experienced maybe anxiety as rage, right? Like social anxiety is very uncomfortable to deal with. It's much more comfortable if you just like convert it into rage and then act as though you've been attacked, right? And so I see
mm.
those parallels between mouse science and American politics. I do think when people are lonely, it takes time to get them back into society again. And they do misfire when they do have those interactions. And that causes them to withdraw even more, which gets them deeper into like toxic and dysfunctional echo chambers. And then your whole politics is just a complete mess, you know?
No, for sure. Yeah, we have to be proactive in like, getting to know people and involving ourselves in group and having more opportunities to connect, right? Because it's not just gonna land kind of on your front door. You have to like go out there and initiate conversation and like put yourself out there a bit because from what I got from your book is like it's just such an enriching thing. Weak
Yeah.
ties, strong ties, and just having a big social network, right?
Right. That's the whole buffet. Yeah. I mean, I think it comes down to I feel like a lot of problems in human society come from humans not understanding what humans are and what we
Mm,
need, right? And so I think when people talk about talking to strangers, they talk about it like it's a lark, like it's a fun little add-on.
yeah.
When in fact, like we need it. We need to build our social networks. We need to make friends. We need to make partners. All this stuff, like it is required in order to
Yep.
remain healthy. We have to be social,
Yep.
and we're not. We're far less social now than we were before, and it's causing all sorts of problems. So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, unfortunately, in unless like leaders really start pushing this, it's going to fall to the individuals to like do this themselves.
Yeah, because I think like in the mainstream, people are so aware of the necessity of like eating the right food, getting enough sleep, exercising. But I think like social contact is like almost it's not like it's seen as a fundamental necessity. It's kind of like a luxury. It's something nice, but it's not something I need,
Right. Yeah,
But it
absolutely.
really is.
Or the fact that it's a little effortful um, somehow leads people to think that it should just be avoided, right?
Mm,
Whereas
mm.
like exercise is effortful, you know,
Yeah.
like people are always just like, well, other people are annoying. Like I
Mhm.
get in awkward conversations. It's like, well, exercise is annoying. Like, is there anything more annoying than exercise? I haven't found it. So yeah, it's like you do the work, right? It takes a little bit of work. It takes a little bit of effort, but you get a lot out of it.
Totally. Yeah. No, Joe, I really appreciate your time today. And I want to ask you, is there anything you're working on at the moment? Any projects or books you have in the making?
Yeah, I did a novel. I co-wrote a novel called The Lemon under a pseudonym S.E. Boyd
Okay.
that came out a couple years ago, and we're developing that for Hollywood now. So my partners
Awesome.
and I are working our way through the screenplay, and we have a great director attached to it, and we have producers attached to it. So fingers
Oh,
crossed it
congratulations.
goes. Yeah, we just have to finish this fucking script.
All right.
And yeah, I'm writing. I've got a couple other movie projects I'm developing. My Lemon partners and I have a show that we're developing. And I just started in last week on a new nonfiction project. So another nonfiction book project that I'm like, it's early days. I'm like 4 days into the research, but hopefully it's not something I can talk about now, but hopefully I'll have that out or sold in the next few months.
Okay, very exciting. Okay, I'm going to keep an eye on that.
That's great. Yeah.
Okay, Joe, it was really fun talking to you. I really enjoyed your book and the work you've done, and it's pretty inspiring stuff.
Thank you, James. So it's great to hear. Thanks for reaching out. It was a pleasure talking to you.